June 22, 1944. 0435 hours. Eastern outskirts of Caumont-à-Levant, Normandy. A pale gray mist clung to the hedgerows. The air carried the damp weight of a night that had not yet decided whether to turn into rain or break into sunlight. The front line in this sector shifted almost daily as German reconnaissance units probed, mapped, and reported Allied movements with precise regularity. Among the most persistent threats to the Allied advance were the German armored scout bikes. These vehicles, often Kettenkrader or modified motorcycle half-tracks, operated like fast-moving needles stitching across the battlefield. They slipped through narrow lanes, dashed around hedgerow corners, and vanished long before conventional anti-tank defenses could react. Every passing day brought more losses, more ambushed squads, and more leaked positions. The vehicles moved too fast for sustained rifle fire. They were too lightly armored for artillery to waste shells on, yet too nimble for mines deployed in predictable locations. Their very existence strained the nerves of forward units already stretched across fragile defensive lines. Corporal Arthur Finch stood beside a shallow drainage ditch, scanning the dim road that cut between two walls of dense brush. He was 27 years old, broad-shouldered, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had worked with his hands since he could remember. He grew up on a farm outside Ripon in Yorkshire, a place where machinery never broke at a convenient time. His father taught him to mend tools with whatever scrap metal lay around. His mother taught him that simple solutions were often the most reliable. Finch brought those lessons into the war. He served as a mechanic before the Normandy landings and was later attached to an infantry company after casualties thinned specialist units. He had a talent for understanding how things moved and what made them stop. Most men respected him. A few laughed at his stubborn loyalty to plain, functional ideas. The scout bikes frustrated him deeply. They were not heavy threats like panthers or tigers. They were smaller problems that slipped through cracks and caused real damage. A Kettenkrad could collect intel in under 30 seconds, turn around, and vanish through narrow gaps tanks could never navigate. In the past week, 3 Allied listening posts had been overrun after reconnaissance teams reported their locations. Finch knew the pattern. He could predict the routes based on the terrain. He understood how creatures, machines, and men moved when they needed speed, partial cover, and minimal resistance. His upbringing gave him a habit of studying paths the way a farmer studies cattle trails. He watched for dips in soil, breaks in grass, and the curve of a lane that encouraged acceleration. Doctrine offered little help. The standard anti-tank mines were heavy and best suited for predictable movements of full-sized vehicles. Light scout bikes often skirted those fields or rode along edges at high speed. Tripwire mines required stable surfaces and careful concealment, difficult tasks in Normandy's uneven hedgerow country. Direct fire weapons struggled because the vehicles appeared and vanished before gunners could adjust. The frustration grew. Soldiers cursed at shadows. Officers demanded more patrols. No one found a consistent, low-cost answer. Finch spent long evenings sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, studying terrain around their forward observation point. He traced lines in the dirt with a stick, estimating distances and angles where the scout bikes would likely appear. He noticed a narrow dip just before a bend, a section of compacted earth that formed a natural funnel. The bikes always passed through it. They used it because the ground allowed stable acceleration. Finch recognized the pattern. It reminded him of the way cattle pushed through the same section of a gate line, pressuring the latch from predictable directions. That thought stuck with him. A latch. A trigger. Something simple that reacted to pressure from above. Something that did not rely on perfect terrain placement. Something that could be built from scrap. The concept took shape. He recalled the heavy-duty cattle gate triggers he had repaired hundreds of times at home. The design was primitive. A metal bar resting on a pivot. A plate or board above it. Weight applied, the bar shifted, the latch released. The principle was consistent across agriculture. Pressure in one spot triggered movement somewhere else. Finch believed he could adapt the idea. He scavenged pieces from broken crates, discarded vehicle parts, and the remains of a damaged trailer. He gathered a length of steel bar, a hinge plate, and a section of thick wooden plank. He repurposed a spring from an old motorbike shock absorber. His plan involved embedding a pressure plate just beneath the soil surface. A Kettenkrad's front wheel would roll over it, forcing downward weight. The shift would release a holding pin that supported either a heavy obstacle or an explosive charge. The obstacle could be a log suspended horizontally from a concealed frame. The explosive could be a standard anti-tank mine held in place by the pin mechanism. Finch preferred the obstacle. It was silent, reusable, and did not require explosives. When he explained the idea to his company sergeant, the man raised an eyebrow. When he explained it to the platoon lieutenant, the officer laughed and asked him whether he planned to run a farm or a battlefield. Word spread. Some men mocked him. They called it the cattle gate trigger. They joked that he should build a barn around it. Others dismissed the concept because it seemed too low-tech. Many believed only factory-produced weapons could yield reliable results. Finch listened to every remark. None changed his mind. He knew how gates worked. He knew how mechanical weight triggered motion. He knew the terrain favored simple, pressure-based traps more than conventional mines. He trusted his experience. At dusk, he returned to the chosen bend in the road. He spent hours digging a narrow channel to house the pressure plate. He packed soil around it. He tested the movement repeatedly using stones and equipment to mimic weight distribution. He reinforced the release arm with scrap steel to prevent warping. He camouflaged the visible components. Behind a hedge, he lashed a thick log across a wooden frame built from spare planks. The log hung slightly above eye level, held in place by a pin linked to the pressure plate. When engaged, the pin would slide free and gravity would drop the log with brutal force. He calculated the mass and momentum. He confirmed the arc of the drop would strike the front of any vehicle coming through the dip at speed. The mechanism worked during each test. Finch wrote the numbers in a small notebook. He measured distance from trigger to impact. He estimated the force delivered. He adjusted the hinge twice. He reinforced the pin housing. By midnight he felt confident. The trap was ready. All he needed was approval to deploy it officially. Corporal Finch approached his platoon lieutenant the next morning. The man listened with mild impatience, arms crossed, fatigue showing through his dust-coated uniform. Reports from the previous night indicated yet another German scout bike sighting near their sector. The threat persisted. Finch explained the design step by step. He described the pressure plate, the log drop, and the calculated impact force. The lieutenant exhaled slowly, weighing his options. On one hand, he doubted the reliability of a farm-style contraption built from battlefield scrap. On the other, they had no viable alternatives that worked consistently. After a tense pause, he gave reluctant approval. Finch could deploy it on a trial basis, provided it did not interfere with standard defenses. Finch nodded and left immediately. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet determination to prove the concept. By late afternoon he finalized the installation. He checked the alignment of the overhead log from several angles. He confirmed that the pressure plate sat flush with the surrounding earth. He disguised the trigger with a thin layer of dust and leaves. The entire system blended naturally into the road's profile. The hedgerows formed a thick concealment, masking the overhead frame and the log. A passerby would notice nothing unless they knelt and pressed the ground with deliberate force. Finch stepped back and studied the scene. The trap looked ordinary. The silence felt appropriate. Night settled over the countryside. A low fog drifted along the road, muffling distant gunfire. Finch joined a two-man observation team stationed in a shallow recess behind the hedge. Their task was to monitor the road and confirm whether any scout bike passed through. The hours stretched with minimal conversation. These moments reminded Finch of night vigils on the farm, waiting for predators near the chicken coop or monitoring cattle fields. Only now the stakes were far greater. At 0210 hours, the distant hum of an engine drifted down the lane. It grew louder, steadier, and carried the distinctive mechanical rhythm of a Kettenkrad. Finch stiffened. The observation team leaned forward. The vehicle approached with predictable confidence, using the narrow road as a corridor. Its headlights were dimmed. Its speed was moderate but purposeful. The crew likely expected no resistance. Scout bikes often operated with the assumption that their agility kept them safe. This overconfidence had cost Allied units dearly. The Kettenkrad entered the dip in the road. Finch waited, breath held tight. The front wheel rolled across the pressure plate. The trigger arm shifted. The steel pin slid free with a faint click. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then gravity delivered its answer. The heavy log dropped from its frame with violent speed. It struck the front section of the Kettenkrad with crushing force. The impact shattered the front wheel assembly and drove the nose of the vehicle downward. The collision jarred the entire frame. Metal bent. Sparks flashed. The vehicle lurched sideways, skidding into the hedge. The engine choked and died. The crew never had time to react. One man was thrown clear. Another remained trapped beneath the damaged controls. Finch and the two observers approached cautiously with weapons ready. They secured the surviving German, who was dazed and confused. The man stared at the broken log trap with disbelief. He muttered something about farm tricks and expected sabotage. He could not comprehend how a simple wooden structure had defeated an armored reconnaissance vehicle. Word spread quickly through the company. Men gathered around the damaged Kettenkrad in the following daylight, studying the splintered log and twisted metal. Some laughed in amazement. Others shook their heads in quiet respect. The same soldiers who had mocked Finch now inspected the mechanism with genuine curiosity. A few admitted that they had underestimated his approach. The lieutenant, previously skeptical, nodded in approval. The effectiveness of the trap was undeniable. The success of the cattle gate trigger reached the battalion command post within hours. Reports described the trap as non-standard but effective. Officers requested a detailed explanation. Finch presented his notes, sketches, and calculations. The senior officers were surprised by the simplicity and reliability. They realized the design required minimal resources and could be replicated quickly by other units. The terrain favored such traps. Hedgerow country provided concealment for overhead frames. Narrow roads and dips allowed predictable trigger points. The Germans relied heavily on swift reconnaissance. This combination created a perfect environment for Finch's idea. Within 2 days, Finch oversaw the construction of 3 additional traps in nearby sectors. He trained small teams on assembly techniques. He taught them how to measure trigger weight, align obstacles, and camouflage components. He emphasized reinforcement of hinges and careful placement of pressure plates. The soldiers listened with attentiveness. They recognized the value of a tactic that neutralized scouts without expending scarce munitions. The traps became a quiet but critical asset. The German reconnaissance units reacted with wary adjustments. They became more cautious in their routes. They slowed near dips in the road. They began probing with poles or sending infantry ahead to inspect suspicious terrain. These changes reduced their speed and effectiveness. The Allied positions gained precious time to relocate or reinforce before reconnaissance reports reached enemy command. The cattle gate trigger altered the rhythm of the battlefield in subtle but meaningful ways. As the days passed, Finch refined his approach. He experimented with alternative materials, including metal bars scavenged from destroyed half-tracks and thicker planks recovered from supply crates. He designed variants of the trigger that could release weighted beams instead of logs. He tested linking pressure plates to explosive charges for scenarios where obstacles could not be suspended. Each improvement came from practical experience. Finch never viewed his invention as a single solution. He saw it as a flexible method. His peers viewed him differently now. They no longer dismissed his rural instincts. They acknowledged his mechanical skill. Some joked less harshly about farming. Others asked him to show them how latch mechanisms worked. Soldiers with engineering backgrounds studied his designs to integrate adjustments. The platoon lieutenant reported Finch's results to higher command with genuine respect. He called Finch resourceful, disciplined, and precise. Despite the recognition, Finch remained modest. He avoided exaggerating the trap's impact. He understood the device was not a decisive war-winning tool. It was a means to solve a specific problem in a specific environment. Its strength lay in its simplicity. It offered a tactical edge in moments where conventional weapons failed. Finch valued effectiveness over praise. The Germans tried countermeasures. They altered their approach angles. They widened reconnaissance teams. They attempted flanking maneuvers through fields. Some succeeded. Others encountered new traps. The cattle gate trigger, despite its low-tech appearance, introduced uncertainty into German planning. Their scouts hesitated at blind corners. Their confidence weakened. Allied units captured several more Kettenkrader over the next week, each disabled by variants of Finch's mechanism. By the beginning of July, the presence of Finch's traps reshaped the defensive posture of the companies operating near Caumont-Elevant. Officers reported improved security in forward-listening posts. Patrols returned with fewer casualties. Some units that previously relied heavily on explosive mines began supplementing their defenses with pressure-based obstacles modeled directly on Finch's cattle gate trigger. The design gained traction because it required no factory components and placed minimal strain on supply chains already under pressure from the rapid advance. The most significant improvement came in the form of predictable reaction time. Typically, German scout bikes conducted reconnaissance runs with such speed that Allied units had only seconds to process the event. The machines zigzagged through hedgerows, recorded positions, and vanished before riflemen or machine gunners could align shots. Finch's traps slowed this rhythm. They forced the reconnaissance units to approach more cautiously. They created pockets of uncertainty along previously safe routes. Every moment of hesitation provided Allied infantry with opportunities to reposition, hide sensitive equipment, or prepare ambushes. Finch continued to refine his trigger mechanisms. His notes from early July reflected adjustments in spring tension, improved camouflaging techniques, and measurements of force exerted by various German light vehicles. He documented the weight of different scout bike models and estimated the distribution of load across front wheels. He even recorded the average approach speed of vehicles at different times of day. His engineering mindset transformed the cattle gate trigger from a crude improvisation into a repeatable defensive method supported by practical data. On the morning of July 6, Finch received an unusual request. Battalion engineers wanted to observe the trap in action from close range. This was a departure from normal procedure. Engineers rarely concern themselves with improvised devices unless they believed a concept had broader potential. Finch prepared a demonstration using a suspended beam designed to simulate a Kettenkrade's mass. The pressure plate triggered cleanly. The beam dropped and struck a target box with calculated force. The engineers exchanged glances. They asked questions about tension settings, frame stability, and the ideal angle for the drop. Finch answered each question with concise precision. He spoke from experience, not theory. After the demonstration, one of the engineers remarked that Finch's design reminded him of counterweight traps used in early defensive warfare. Finch nodded. He had studied none of those historical examples, yet the principle resonated with universal mechanical logic. The engineer left with detailed diagrams and measurements, suggesting the trap could be standardized into field manuals if reliability remained consistent. The next major test came 2 days later. That night, a storm rolled across the region. Wind rattled branches. Rain soaked the ground. Visibility dropped to near zero. These conditions often emboldened German reconnaissance teams. The sound of rain masked engine noise. Mud softened terrain. Many officers expected scout bikes to exploit the storm. Finch remained in position near one of his newer trap sites, a narrow corridor bordered by a high hedge on the left and a shallow ditch on the right. The cattle gate trigger variant installed there incorporated an improved hinge and a reinforced overhead beam. At 0300 hours, faint engine noise blended with the sound of rainfall. Finch strained to listen. The noise grew louder. A German reconnaissance team advanced cautiously. The vehicle's dim light cut through sheets of rain as it approached the corridor. Finch remained still, eyes fixed on the pressure plate location. The Kettenkrade progressed slowly at first, then picked up speed as the rider sought to clear the muddy ground. The front wheel compressed the pressure plate. The hinge flexed. The release pin snapped free. The heavy beam dropped. It struck the vehicle's front assembly with brutal force. The impact echoed through the storm. The Kettenkrade collapsed forward, its engine sputtering. The rider flew sideways and crashed into the ditch. The scout sitting in the rear seat tumbled backward, stunned. Finch and 2 nearby riflemen moved quickly. They secured the area, confirmed the injuries, and captured the surviving scout. The trap had performed flawlessly even in poor weather conditions. Finch noted the results. He recorded the rain's effect on pressure sensitivity. His trap now proved effective under a broad range of environmental variables. That success elevated Finch's reputation further. Officers trusted him with increased autonomy. They allowed him to coordinate trap placement across multiple companies operating near the sector. Finch never sought command, but he understood responsibility. He traveled between units, inspected terrain, and identified ideal locations based on enemy movement patterns. His agricultural instincts, honed from years of observing animal behavior and landscape contours, now guided tactical decisions across a battlefield. Soldiers treated his observations with respect. They listened when he pointed out subtle depressions in soil or natural choke points concealed by vegetation. The variety of traps grew. Finch introduced a double hinge variant that released 2 obstacles simultaneously. He tested a vertical drop design intended for narrow lanes with overhead cover. He experimented with counterweights that increased impact force without requiring heavier beams. He built collapsing frame traps for muddy terrain where logs or beams risked sticking. Every experiment involved precise measurements. Every improvement sought practical value. His workshop, once a small corner of a supply tent, expanded into a dedicated space stocked with metal fragments, spare hinges, and wooden beams. German forces took notice. Reconnaissance units altered their routes significantly. The once predictable patterns grew erratic. Some units abandoned certain roads entirely. They dispatched infantry scouts ahead of vehicles more frequently. However, this adjustment slowed their intelligence gathering. Machines designed for speed now advanced cautiously, reducing their scouting efficiency. Finch observed this behavior change with interest. He realized the traps not only destroyed targets but also shaped enemy behavior in ways beneficial to Allied forces. On July 12, a German reconnaissance group attempted a more covert approach. They moved through a lightly wooded area parallel to the road. Finch anticipated such an adjustment. His team had prepared a trap just inside the tree line, using a narrower pressure plate and a suspended beam positioned between two sturdy trunks. The Kettenkrad advanced through the woods, likely believing the tree cover provided safety. The front wheel struck the concealed plate. The beam dropped at a diagonal angle. It smashed into the vehicle's side with crushing precision. The German rider was incapacitated. The scout attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended by a nearby patrol. This ambush reinforced a critical truth. Finch's trap did not rely on the enemy following roads. It relied on weight, motion, and predictable paths through natural terrain. Whether along a hedgerow lane, a dirt track, or a narrow forest gap, the pressure plate mechanism adapted to the environment. Finch recorded the test results as usual, noting the effects of uneven forest soil on trigger sensitivity. As word of his repeated successes spread, senior officers began referencing Finch's methods during operational briefings. Some compared his impact to improvised countermeasures used by resistance groups in occupied Europe. Others described him as a practical engineer whose solutions emerged organically from battlefield necessity. Finch brushed aside such comments. He valued accuracy, not compliments. He continued refining the trap because each improvement represented fewer casualties and fewer compromised positions. Toward mid-July, German reconnaissance activity decreased markedly. This absence did not mean the threat had vanished. It meant the enemy recalibrated. Finch warned officers that the Germans were likely developing counter-strategies. He predicted they would introduce heavier scouts, perhaps armored cars, to replace vulnerable bikes. He recommended reinforcing trap frames, widening pressure plates, and testing mechanisms capable of disabling larger vehicles. His warnings proved well-timed. Reports on July 16 indicated that German SD-KFZ 221 armored cars were spotted near the sector. The arrival of the SD-KFZ 221 changed the dynamic of German reconnaissance. This armored car carried heavier plating and a mounted machine gun. It posed a greater threat than the Kettenkrad. Finch understood that his original cattle gate trigger could cripple light vehicles but might not deliver enough force against a reinforced front plate. He spent the night reviewing his notes, studying diagrams of German armored cars, and considering the weak points in their design. He focused on exposed components near the lower chassis. He believed a heavier drop beam, combined with a stronger trigger assembly, could generate enough force to damage the suspension or steering column. At dawn, Finch visited the battalion engineers. He requested access to thicker metal segments recovered from a destroyed German half-track. The engineers agreed. They helped him cut a long section of steel plating. Finch examined the weight distribution. He measured the beam's length and estimated the impact force when dropped from height. The numbers impressed the engineers. A reinforced beam dropped from a stable frame could shatter steering components on most light armored cars. Finch proposed building a new trap using the same pressure plate trigger, but the release pin and frame needed reinforcement. The engineers approved his plan. Finch and a small team scouted terrain for a suitable test location. They selected a narrow lane framed by high hedgerows. The ground dipped slightly before curving left. The curve encouraged drivers to maintain moderate speed. The enclosed space created natural conditions for a suspended drop beam. Finch designed a frame capable of supporting the heavier beam. He strengthened the hinge using parts from a destroyed trailer. He replaced wooden supports with metal braces. The pressure plate remained the same size, but he adjusted the linkage to ensure smooth release despite the increased weight. Building the new trap took most of the day. The frame had to withstand damp soil and shifting ground. Finch secured the metal braces with long stakes driven deep into the earth. He double-checked every bolt and hinge point. The pressure plate linked cleanly to the release pin. He tested the mechanism multiple times using rocks and equipment to simulate weight. Each test released the beam properly. Finch documented every measurement and confirmed that the trap could function under battlefield conditions. That night the sky cleared. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the hedgerows. Finch returned to the new trap site with 2 riflemen. They positioned themselves behind a dense thicket. The silence stretched long. German activity had grown unpredictable. The arrival of armored cars suggested reconnaissance patterns were shifting again. Finch knew the enemy wanted to reassert control over the sector. Shortly after 0200 hours, the sound of a distant engine broke the quiet. The tone was deeper and more deliberate than that of a Kettenkrad. Finch recognized the growl of the SD, KZ 221. He whispered a warning. The riflemen steadied their positions. The armored car approached slowly at first as if testing the lane. The driver increased speed just before entering the dip. The headlights flickered across the road surface. The armored car's front wheels rolled onto the pressure plate. The plate compressed. The hinge responded. The release pin dropped free. The heavy beam fell with violent force. The impact struck the vehicle's right front wheel assembly. Metal screeched. The steering column bent under the sudden load. The front of the armored car twisted sharply. Its wheel jammed against the hedgerow. The engine sputtered and stalled. The vehicle tilted at an awkward angle. The crew inside reacted in shock. One man tried to push open the turret hatch. Another attempted to climb out through the side door. Finch and the riflemen moved carefully. They kept their weapons trained on the armored car. The hatch opened slowly. A German crewman emerged with his hands raised. Another followed moments later. Both were disoriented. Neither understood how a suspended beam had disabled their armored vehicle. Finch secured the prisoners and inspected the damaged car. The beam had struck exactly where he intended. The reinforced weight shattered the suspension. The steering linkage bent beyond repair. The vehicle was immobilized. At dawn, a crowd gathered around the disabled SD KFZ 221. Officers studied the beam's angle of impact. Engineers inspected the pressure plate. Soldiers traced the frame with their hands, surprised by the simplicity of its construction. Finch explained the design in plain terms. He emphasized that the trap used gravity, not artillery. The officers recognized the significance. This method offered a way to counter light armored threats without consuming valuable ammunition. Finch received direct commendation from the battalion commander. The man praised Finch's ingenuity and encouraged him to continue refining his designs. Over the next week, Finch adapted his traps for even more scenarios. He developed a variant intended for soft soil and mud. This design used a different hinge structure that prevented the beam from sticking during the drop. He created a narrow beam version for forest paths. He increased the size of the pressure plate for areas where armored cars traveled in pairs. Every improvement addressed a specific environmental challenge. The Germans responded with new tactics. They deployed infantry scouts with long poles to probe the ground ahead of vehicles. They used explosive charges to collapse suspicious hedgerow sections. They altered their night movement patterns. Some armored cars avoided roads entirely and traveled through fields. Finch anticipated these changes. He modified pressure plates to function beneath shallow grass and mud. He relocated traps to natural choke points. He predicted the paths vehicles would take based on terrain shape and soil firmness. On July 20th, a German reconnaissance team attempted a bold maneuver. They sent an armored car followed by 2 infantry scouts down a narrow corridor near a burnt farmhouse. They believed the open area reduced the risk of overhead traps. Finch had prepared a different variant there. Instead of a suspended beam, he designed a pivoting side strike mechanism. The pressure plate triggered a swinging timber reinforced with metal bars. The timber struck the armored car's side as it passed. The impact crushed part of the wheel housing. The vehicle rolled partially onto its side. The infantry scouts panicked and fled. Allied riflemen captured the surviving crew. This event strengthened Finch's reputation further. Officers described his traps as practical, repeatable, and adaptable. They praised his ability to predict enemy choices based on terrain. Finch continued documenting every test result. His notebook filled with sketches, angles, distances, and notes on soil behavior. Soldiers borrowed his notes to replicate traps in their own sectors. Despite the widespread praise, Finch remained focused on improvement. He knew the Germans would keep adapting. He expected heavier recon vehicles or changes in formation. He warned officers to prepare for countermeasures. His predictions proved correct again. Reports indicated that German units now equipped some scout cars with plated underside guards. Finch considered this challenge carefully. He believed the answer lay in increasing impact force or shifting the drop point to a more vulnerable angle. He began designing a heavier beam variant supported by a reinforced frame. He tested different hinge materials. He calculated force increases. His workshop grew more complex. Engineers visited regularly to study his progress. Officers requested trap placement recommendations before planning patrols. By late July, Finch's traps became an integral part of the defensive network. They slowed German reconnaissance. They reduced surprise attacks. They protected exposed listening posts. They bought critical time during the Allied push through Normandy. Finch understood the impact. He also understood the cost. Every trap existed because soldiers had died earlier in the campaign. As August approached, the Allied advance gained momentum. German forces continued to resist fiercely, but their ability to conduct fast and reliable reconnaissance weakened. Finch's traps played a small but meaningful role in this shift. Reports across the division noted reduced enemy scouting runs in sectors where pressure plate mechanisms were deployed. Officers recognized the pattern. Where the traps existed, German scouts hesitated or avoided the area entirely. This hesitation created information gaps on the German side. These gaps allowed Allied units to reposition or execute flanking movements with less risk of early detection. Finch studied these results with quiet attention. He remained aware that battlefield success often depended on subtle changes that compounded over time. A delay of 30 seconds at a choke point. A half-kilometer detour chosen by a cautious driver. A reconnaissance report arriving 5 minutes late. These small delays shaped the planning cycle of both sides. Finch never claimed his traps altered the war. He claimed only that they preserved lives by disrupting enemy patterns. This truth guided his work. In early August, Finch joined a company moving toward a newly contested sector west of Caumont. The region featured narrow sunken lanes shaped by centuries of erosion. High hedgerows and earthen banks created natural corridors perfect for ambushes. Finch saw opportunity in this terrain. He selected 3 locations for trap placement. One was a narrow lane with a sharp rise, ideal for a vertical drop mechanism. Another was a split track where 2 paths converged. He built a wide pressure plate to cover both paths. The third was a shallow depression near a fallen tree. He used the tree as part of a swinging beam design. During this period, German forces attempted to regain initiative. They launched aggressive reconnaissance pushes supported by light infantry. One night, a German unit advanced along the converging paths near Finch's second trap. The Kettenkrad in the lead moved quickly, followed by riflemen. The vehicle rolled across the wide pressure plate. The release mechanism activated. 2 beams dropped at once. Both struck the light vehicle from different angles. Metal buckled. The machine collapsed with a violent jerk. The infantry behind it stopped abruptly and scattered. Allied riflemen positioned nearby opened fire. The engagement ended quickly. The beams worked exactly as intended. Later that week, enemy units tried probing the area with increased caution. Finch observed their behavior from concealed positions. The Germans stopped often. They sent men ahead with poles to test the ground. They inspected trees and hedges for overhead frames. Finch noted each attempt in his notebook. He understood that every hour spent checking for traps limited the Germans' ability to conduct deeper reconnaissance. The traps forced the enemy to think defensively instead of acting aggressively. On August 9, Finch faced one of his most difficult challenges. A report arrived stating that a German armored car with reinforced front plating was moving rapidly through a lane previously considered too open for traps. Finch inspected the lane. The overhead cover was minimal. The soil was dry and firm. Traditional drop beams would not conceal well here. He decided to build a horizontal strike mechanism set into a bank along the roadside. The pressure plate sat several meters ahead of the mechanism. Triggering the plate would release a strong tension beam from the side, aimed at the lower wheel assembly of the armored car. Time was limited. Finch and 2 soldiers worked quickly. They dug into the bank, installed metal braces, set the beam in place and calibrated the tension. The sun was already setting by the time they finished. Finch tested the linkage twice. Everything functioned correctly. He covered the pressure plate with dust and grass, walked the lane once more and returned to a concealed position. Near midnight, engine noise approached. The armored car advanced with confidence. Its headlights illuminated the lane. Finch remained still. The front wheels passed over the pressure plate. The release arm shifted. The side-mounted beam shot forward with tremendous force. It struck the armored car's wheel housing, smashing the suspension. The vehicle lurched sideways. The engine cut out. German infantry following behind scrambled for cover. Allied soldiers engaged them immediately. The firefight ended quickly. Finch inspected the vehicle before dawn. The beam had cracked the lower chassis and rendered the armored car immobile. This event confirmed the adaptability of the cattle gate trigger concept. It was not limited to one direction or one terrain type. It could strike from above, from the side, or at angles adjusted to the environment. Finch documented the results, adding new diagrams to his already thick notebook. Engineers visiting the site noted the practicality of a side strike design. They discussed integrating these variants into training materials for other units. As the Allied push continued, Finch spent less time building traps and more time advising companies on terrain assessment. His understanding of natural choke points, dips, soil pressure and movement patterns became an asset that officers sought frequently. He taught soldiers to read the land the way a farmer reads fields. He explained how weight distribution reveals common paths. He pointed out where vehicles instinctively slow and where they accelerate. These lessons improved defensive positioning even in areas without traps. By late August, German resistance in the region weakened significantly. Reconnaissance reports from enemy prisoners confirmed the psychological impact of Finch's traps. Many scout drivers feared narrow lanes or shaded dips. Some refused to travel routes known for ambushes. Others demanded infantry support before moving ahead. Finch understood that fear disrupted efficiency. Machines that once moved freely now crawled with caution. When the Allied forces secured the sector, Finch's role shifted again. He assisted engineers in documenting the final versions of each trap. They recorded measurements, materials, and recommended placement strategies. They included observations on soil firmness, hinge durability, and frame reinforcement. Finch answered every question with clarity. He wanted future units to understand the principles behind each design. After the war, Corporal Arthur Finch returned to Yorkshire. He resumed work as a mechanic on the same farm where he had learned to fix gates and mend machinery. He rarely spoke about his wartime contributions. To him, the traps were practical solutions, not symbols of heroism. His former officers, however, remembered him differently. Some wrote recommendations praising his mechanical ingenuity and his ability to read terrain. A few engineers kept his notes and used them to teach concepts of improvised defensive engineering. For many years, Finch remained unknown outside his unit. His traps never became widespread doctrine. They existed only where terrain allowed and where resourcefulness mattered more than standard equipment. Yet the soldiers who served near Caumont during the summer of 1944 remembered the quiet corporal who built deadly mechanisms from scrap wood and metal. They remembered the man who used a simple pressure plate, a hinge, and a weighted beam to stop fast-moving reconnaissance units that once seemed untouchable. They remembered how his work saved lives by slowing the invisible hand of the enemy. Finch kept his notebook. Its pages held diagrams, soil measurements, sketches of hedgerows, and calculations of force. It represented months of fieldwork shaped by loss, necessity, and relentless adaptation. He placed it in a drawer at home. He did not seek recognition. He valued only the results and the knowledge that his traps gave Allied soldiers a fighting chance in a landscape filled with danger. The story of Arthur Finch endures quietly in military records. It highlights the power of simple ideas applied with precision. It shows that ingenuity can emerge from humble origins. It proves that solutions do not require complexity when the mind behind them understands weight, motion, and the land itself.